I guess there's a first lesson here, which is, when you have the opportunity to ask smart people stupid questions, you should go for it.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Google Firestarters. My name is Neil Perkin. I'm the curator of Firestarters and also the founder of consultancy business Only Dead Fish. And so for the uninitiated, Firestarters is a series of conversations with the interested and interesting of the advertising and marketing community. And today's guest is both interested and interesting. So I'm delighted to welcome Agathe Guerrier, the Global Chief Strategy Officer for TBWA worldwide. So Agathe, if it's okay with you, I'm going to go straight into my first question, if that's all right. What's the best thing that you've learned in your career to date? So welcome, Agathe.
Thank you. I think the best, well, definitely the most useful thing that I've learned in my career is that ratios are dumb. Well, let me rephrase in a slightly more nuanced way. Ratios are not a good thing to focus on solely as your measure of success. It's usually more helpful to look at ratios in the context of absolute value and impact. And this is something that I kind of discovered, probably 10 years ago. When I was made head of strategy at BBH London, there were a number of kind of other, jobs that came with that job. And one was, please can you join the IPA Value of Creativity Council, which Les Binet was chairing at the time. And so I kind of joined that group, and I was very out of my depth because I think until then I had been very much a creative strategist rather than a numbers strategist, and so I had won quite a lot of creative awards or, been part of the team that did. But I was definitely light on the effectiveness awards, and I was definitely light on how does this all work really to drive success for our clients? And so it definitely had, this kind of, it's not imposter syndrome at that point. It's like genuinely don't know what you're doing syndrome. So joined the council, and I remember attending a meeting. The meeting was actually taking place at BBH on Kingly Street. And we had this whole long conversation about, the distinction between effectiveness and efficiency and how people were getting those two notions confused when they were so fundamentally different. So this goes on, etc. And then people leave. And because it's at BBH, I'm kind of lingering behind and pretending to tidy the room. And Les is still in the room because he's also gathering his papers. So I'm like, oh, Les, great session. Anyway, what is the difference between effectiveness and efficiency? And so he explains to me that efficiency is a ratio and effectiveness is an absolute number. And that is the big difference between the two. And so if you solely focus on efficiency, which at the time we were deep in that world of digital media having taken over the world, and so everyone was looking at, cost per acquisition and click-through rates. So everyone was looking at ratios. And he was saying, that's fine, and ratios are important, but the problem is if you only look at ratio, there will come a point where the only way to continue to maintain that ratio in the absence of new value being created and inputted into the funnel at the top is you're going to slowly decrease the value of your investment so that you continue to maintain the ratio to a point where you're going to have an excellent ratio, but an absolute impact created that is close to zero because you're investing so little in the first place. And that was a real aha moment for me where I was like, wow, I've understood something quite profound today. So I guess there's a first lesson here, which is, when you have the opportunity to ask smart people stupid questions, you should go for it. But I think that notion of the distinction between ratio and absolute impact, the distinction between effectiveness and efficiency, I just continue to come back to. Like, I think it is a really helpful way to talk to clients about, how they spend their money and where they look to assess impact. I think, we're having a lot of conversation at the moment about digital media and how, you know, the efficiency of digital media is declining and the overall effectiveness of marketing is declining. And so I think we need to be looking at those two things together and thinking about, you know, both value capture and how important it is to be efficient, but also value creation and the role of creativity, you know, in creating new value and creating net new demand in the world, and not just extracting value out of the existing demand. So I think it really helps to think about, you know, how you're spending your money, how you're spending your effort. And similarly, you know, we've developed a methodology at TBWA which looks at understanding the role of brand in driving incremental growth and in driving disruptive growth. And the two things are important, right? And the two things correspond very much to, you know, what is the logical, rational next thing to do, the incremental thing, and then what is the creative, lateral, disruptive thing to do, which looks at disruptive growth. And efficiency type thinking, ratio type thinking is going to get you towards incrementalism, and that's fine, and you should do it. But I think it's important to remember as well that, you know, you want to be looking at the absolute effectiveness as well. So, you know, when we think about, you know, assigning KPIs and thinking about which goals we focus on, you know, I have often found that looking at share is not a great strategy, because you could be optimizing share in a declining category. You could be optimizing share to the detriment of your profitability, for example, through heavy discounting. So I think you always want to be looking at a ratio type metric like share in the context of an absolute value type metric like, you know, net operating income growth, for example.
I think that's so interesting, and I wonder actually if I can ask, because it just strikes me as you're speaking there about the differences between ratios and absolute numbers, that a lot of organizations seem to get caught up in that efficiency trap, you know, just wanting to over optimize all the time, optimize, and not taking that leap forwards that they need to sometimes to rethink something, do something in a different way, create a different model. So why is it that companies get stuck in that kind of ratio efficiency sort of trap?
Well, I think that what's really seductive about the ratio approach is you can control it, right? You're operating within a known universe, whereas I think the effectiveness thinking gets you to actually take risks and get out of your comfort zones, and, you know, potentially implement strategies that might be harder to measure and harder to be accountable to their success. You know, it's the whole half of my advertising is wasted, I just don't know which half. I think, you know, the digital era, let's say, has given us a really big illusion of control. And so people now are finding it, you know, they've forgotten how to flex the risk muscle, the kind of like, I don't fully know how this is going to work, but I think it is going to work, so I'm going to try it kind of muscle. So yeah, I think there's just not really a culture of risk-taking inside organizations. So that's something to work on.
And do you think there's any signals that companies can look at to identify that they're reaching the limits of optimization and that they need something disruptive or something new to really take that step forward? Yeah,
I mean, there was an interesting piece recently about Airbnb's recent strategy, and they've pretty much kind of turned off the short-term, you know, performance marketing spigot, and really focused on product marketing and PR and brand reputation instead, and they're seeing a lot of success out of it. Now, I think it's hard to look at the last 3 years for Airbnb and really isolate the effect of marketing, right? Because there's been so much flux that's coming at a macro market level with COVID, and then working from home and remote work, etc. But I think that's an interesting, you know, indication that big brands, and especially big, you know, digital brands that were very much built on this digital marketing paradigm of we're just going to optimize the out of our performance marketing plan. Even those types of brands are starting to go, well, you know what, actually brand building is turning out to be pretty effective. So I'm hoping there's going to be more stories like that in the next few months.
And I think I read a piece actually where you interviewed about the future strategy. And you were talking about a bit about the importance of brand experience, actually,
Yep.
about brands are effectively built through the experience that people have of the products, of course. But I think you also said that increasingly the imperative is figuring out how the brand lives on a daily basis at this moment in time.
Yep.
So what did you mean by that?
Well, I think what I mean by that is, advertising continues to be important in the way in the different levers that brands have at their disposal to build, presence and attachment, loyalty, and all that good stuff. I do think that it is less important than it used to be. And so now advertising is one tool you have alongside, the total ecosystem of experiences through which your brand lives. And I think if you're honest with yourself and you try and think about what were the last 3, really memorable interactions I had with the brand, one might be an ad or something that looks like communications, maybe, but I think it's more likely that they're going to be, a great app experience you had, or a really easy booking process, or something that happened in the store or on the premises in retail or in hospitality. So these kind of daily experiences are, I think, where most of the brand lives and is built today, which kind of makes sense, right? That own channels is primarily where the brand lives. But I think that requires a bit of a mindset shift for a lot of agency people.
So let me ask my second question, because talking about learning, I'd love to know what was the biggest mistake that you made in your career, and what did you learn from that?
Yeah, I mean, that's an easy one because it's pretty glaring mistake. I think the biggest mistake that I made was thinking that my job was to be the smartest person in the room. So thinking that, being a strategist was all about being right, and then everything else would follow. And it turns out everything else does not follow from being right. And it turns out, being focused on the task and being great at the task is one thing, and that's great. But if you want to really create change, in your own career and for your agency and for the brand you work for and for your team, you really need to think about relationships and trust and followership. And so I think that, the big learning for me was it kind of doesn't matter to be right alone. That's mostly irrelevant. You need to, and it's okay to take a hit on correctness and interestingness for the sake of building followership. I think that's true, of running and managing teams. I think it's true of getting clients to buy brave ideas, because at the end of the day, they will buy it because they trust you as a person on a human level, because you've built that trust over time, etc. Mm-hmm. They are very unlikely to do something brave just because you've done this, the slides and the business casing, and you've kind of proven it out logically. So again, it's those two things working together. I mean, being right and being smart is great, but it's like, well, how else are you going to make people, follow you towards that strategy, towards that direction?
Yeah, I guess it's difficult, isn't it? Because we recorded an episode with Ian Leslie, who has written a great book on constructive disagreement, effectively. Mm-hmm. And he was talking about the value of that kind of healthy debate. When you don't know the answer to something, actually having a constructive kind of argument, effectively, just to get to the kind of bottom of something. But how do you do that in a client situation? I mean, sure, the client is coming to you for advice, and so you need to have an answer, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I think having answers is important, but I think knowing how to ask questions is probably more important at the bottom. At the end of the day, I think being a really good listener is really important. A lot of the interactions I have with clients probably feel a lot more like kind of corporate therapy, or a kind of 21st century version of a Socratic dialogue, than they do necessarily, a sermon in a church or a TED talk, right? I think a lot of clients, they need help wading through really complex problems. And actually, if you can provide them with, the clarity and the insight to kind of go, well, I don't know what the answer is, but I do think that, your number one problem is this, and let's just go and spend some time naming that problem really clearly and really specifically. Like that is a huge value add before you've even gotten to the question. And it's interesting because, I spend a lot of time in the BBH world, and BBH strategy, I mean, I wouldn't say, it's a key principle, but it's definitely part of it that we spend a lot of time telling clients they're wrong. Your brief is stupid, you haven't done this right, let me tell you how to actually run your brand, etc. That's a component of, I think, the BBH strategy brand, which I quite like. And I think sometimes, you want to be using a little bit of that and demonstrating a little bit of superiority and expertise, and hold on, I've got a different idea on this. But I think most of the time you want to be in kind of collaboration, dialogue, getting through things together mode. I think that's what's required today.
Yeah, I think there was a great analogy which Jim Carroll used in his episode, which I think was about planners as psychiatrists. So it was basically talking about how, the answers exist within the organization often, and the planner's job is to sort of find them and to really, get that sort of knowledge that the organization doesn't know it has almost out in order to really understand how to solve problems well. So let me move on to my next question, because I'd love to get your insights now into how you think the industry itself is changing, and how strategy and planning is changing as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is actually connected to what we were just talking about, because my observation, and it might also be that, I also look at strategy from a different angle now, right? Because I'm looking at, TBWA's brand and what we stand for and what we bring to the marketplace that is valuable to our clients and differentiate from competitors, etc. And then when I do go into, client briefs as well, it's usually less, an experience brief or a campaign brief, and more a kind of macro marketing problem. But what that perspective tells me is that strategy is maybe less about strategy and more about organizational psychology today. So what I'm finding is that, getting to the correct answer is actually quite easy most of the time. It's then getting the organization to understand the strategy, to want to implement it, and then to implement it successfully. Like that's the real crux of it. And so, I think what I'm finding is, yes, there continues to be a lot of emphasis on, being able to look at a lot of information and then distill it into, an answer that feels both correct and interesting, right? That's kind of how I always summarize strategy to juniors. It's like, figure out what the logical thing to do, and then figure out how you make that more interesting than just the logical thing to do. So that continues to be important, but I think increasingly it's about, how do we sell this strategy through the organization? How do we make it easy for people to adhere to implement it across organizational silos, even as though people continue to be people, right? So generally there's a bias towards inertia, there is a fear of change, and so change is hard. So I think what that means is great strategists today have to embrace some of the things that they maybe historically were kind of looking down on. So things like, there's meetings all the time, and this client organization has a lot of politics. And yes, absolutely. And there will continue to be meetings all the time. And any large organization is going to have politics and organizational complexity and silos and people who don't get on. That's just a fact. And so your job now is not just to go away and like write great decks and great briefs and great presentation and great points of view. Your job is to be in the meetings and to really work that meeting so that it becomes a turning point where everyone has, understood and aligned to a strategy. Your job is really thinking about the politics and figuring out, well, knowing everything I know about this organization and who likes who and doesn't like who, what is the path that I can carve from my idea to actually make it through the organization and get from, elegant presentation to actual initiatives and behavior. So I think, a great strategist today needs to be able to have a strategy for navigating the politics, have a strategy for winning the meeting, and just embrace these attributes of corporate life that we might not like, but we have to be good at.
And it is part of this as well about understanding how you get a strategy through an organization from the point of view of execution. Who's going to do what, and how that implicates on different functions or departments, perhaps. Is that part of it as well?
Yeah, definitely. And I think our clients' biggest challenge today is complexity, internal and external, because most of the time now we work with clients that they're either part of a brand team, a comms team, a marketing team, and then marketing itself, there's usually brand marketing, performance marketing, product marketing, and then outside of that there's probably a separate team that does pricing and promotion, and a separate team that does distribution and retail and e-com. So and really all of this is the brand, right? And I think the exciting thing about being in charge of the brand is that gives you a key to go and create change in all of these different departments. But they're different departments. So figuring that out, I think, is the hardest thing about being a strategist today.
Yeah. And so if I can take that into my next question, if that's all right, and just ask you about your prediction about how strategy and planning is changing, and so what does all of that mean for how the discipline and function is actually changing itself?
Yeah, and I've touched on this already, but yeah, I do think strategy and planning is changing quite a lot. I mean, and again, coming back to that meeting room in BBH London and me asking Les what effectiveness is, that's a change I've had to make myself. I think I came from a version of strategy that was quite conventional, where really a great strategist was a great writer. You could really hone in, craft a proposition, this kind of single-minded proposition that became the jumping off point for creative ideation. I was really good at that, and I thought that was my job. And again, I think it's a good skill to have, and it's an important skill in the context of advertising, where your task is, let's figure out what the brand needs to say. But I think today that's quite a small part of what it means to be a good strategist. So, I think if you can broaden out what it means to be a strategist to a new definition that is, you are data literate and as well as kind of word literate, so you can count as well as write, and you're going to use all of that kind of analytical power to help clients very clearly name problems and map out potential solutions. I think that skill of reduction towards simple naming of problem so that you can then start to unpack how to solve the problem. I think to me, that is what I've come to as, okay, if I can do this, I will be employed forever because the world is full of problems. And, and marketing organizations are definitely full of complexity and problems. But I think it does require a different type of skill that is, definitely more of a group exercise and more of a, something that touches on, really understanding business, really understanding how ideas create growth, as well as being an elegant storyteller.
And I think I noted also in that piece that I read that you were talking a bit about strategists as generalists, which I guess is relating to what you're saying there. And you also said that what our clients are asking for now is simplification and integration. Yeah. So simplification has come up quite a lot in Firestarters episodes. So clearly that's a big a big shift, I think. But integration's kind of interesting. So tell me a bit more about integration.
Well, I think the integration point is connected to what I was telling you about how, all of these departments that together can, basically create the brand and live the brand. But they each have, usually different stakeholders, different agencies, different ways of looking at the world, different metrics they're focused on, and they rarely truly come together. And I think, successful marketeers, there was actually a data point, I think, in a Gartner CMO survey, which I can find for you, but successful CMOs tend to be of the unifier type. So they did a kind of taxonomy of different CMOs, and they looked at which ones were performing the best in terms of, their own growth, in terms of their likelihood to be on the board, to become CEOs, which is quite rare. And so the CMOs that do the best are the unifier CMOs. So the CMOs that build relationships and partnerships and basically figure out how to infiltrate and integrate all of these different stakeholders inside their organizations towards a single goal. So it might be that they do monthly one-on-ones where they share information. They create, an annual planning process where everyone comes together and has to commit to a certain degree of synergies towards shared goals, etc. I think that's the integration challenge that, we're also facing, because obviously, TBWA, we're part of Omnicom. Like every other holding company, there's been this trend recently to create these holding company-wide, dedicated agency structures that combine all of the different functions within the holding company, from, creative to CRM and data and media buying and all of this, and then propose this as a package to a client. That is kind of an answer to the integration challenge. It's not really, though, because unless the client organization is integrated, you're just going to replicate the silos, so the CRM person in the agency is going to have its CRM client and so forth. And so you're just, you've kind of cosmetically solved the problem, and you really haven't, which is why I think we need to go and partner with the clients to help them figure out how they integrate on their side, because we can't integrate on our side, really.
That's fascinating and unbelievable. We're running short on time, so I need to ask my final question, which is my catch-all question. But I'd love to know what question that you do you wish that I'd asked you, and what's your answer to that?
I wish you'd asked me how we were evolving the strategic work experience inside agencies, because this is typically one where I don't think we are doing a good job at all. So I think it's a question that I have, identified and named, and as I said, that's part of the answer, but it's definitely not the answer. I think we had a great trigger and kind of impetus with COVID, because it completely, from one day to the next, changed the ways we were working. And in lots of ways it was very stressful, but in lots of ways it actually gave talent what they needed and wanted, which was, clearer boundaries sometimes, more time at home, less time in commute, more quiet time, etc. And now that we're, out of COVID, and that the power dynamic between employers and talent is shifting again, back towards the employers, I think, with, looming recession and layoffs in techs, I think all of the employers have gone, great. Well, you're going to come back into offices and, Monday to Friday, and work starts at 9 and all of that good stuff. Oh, and by the way, of course the sound in the main meeting room doesn't work. Why would it? And I think that's a giant missed opportunity. And I think, we are in a battle for talent. I think agencies have been struggling to attract the best talent. And that's, a trend that's been building for the last 15 years, probably. And it's a big problem. And it's the number one problem we have to solve. We need to figure out how we create an experience of creative work that is what people want, what people expect, and that is different from what it used to be. So I think there's questions like, how do we use technology to help people minimize distractions rather than accelerate distractions? How do we use technology to help people build emotional closeness and trust even though they might not be spending that much time physically together. We know it's possible, but we're just not really thinking about how we make that happen inside our agencies. I think there's also things like, we continue to lament shortening tenures and the fact that young people don't want to work for the same company for 10 years. Like, we need to stop complaining about that and just bake it into the design of how we plan people's careers. So why not, instead of starting from the hypothesis that someone is going to work with us for 15 years, why don't we package up, what does it get you to work with us for 1 year, for 3 years, for 5 years? And maybe there's, growing incentives towards staying longer in terms of pay rises and promotion and opportunity. But I think starting from the basis of, this is how people want to work now, so we need to help them achieve their goals. This is the only way in which it works. Like, I think we've really not made enough progress on this.
So that's so interesting. I think there's a question here which might be a tricky one to answer, but it strikes me from an organization perspective, you need some commonalities here, people to do things in a certain way, or certain times when people need to come together, but you need to balance that with that individual flexibility to work in a certain way that suits me. How do organizations get that balance right, do you think?
I think we just need to trust people more. I think we need to trust our talent, that we can give them the flexibility, and they will use it appropriately. They will, take care of themselves, of their own boundaries, of their own needs, of their own, timing and scheduling requirements. But then they will also do whatever is required to make the commonality exist. I don't know. I think, you have to trust that the people you're hiring are good, decent people who will do the right thing, rather than try and coerce them into, common experiences that no one wants to take part in. It's like, if we are the product and they're the user is always right.
That's a fantastic note on which to end the episode. So thank you so much to my guest today, Agathe. Fantastic insight there and fantastic answers. And thank you so much for being part of Firestarters, Agathe.
Thank you for having me.
No problem. And for everyone listening or watching, please do subscribe, and don't forget to share the episode, and look out for future episodes of Firestarters. So thank you for watching and listening. Thanks to Agathe.